The bar smelled of old leather, stale beer, and secondhand smoke, exactly how it had smelled for the last 30 years. The neon sign outside, barely flickering, still read VFW Post 229, though the 2 was missing half its light. Inside, time had thickened like the dust on the photo of fallen comrades above the jukebox. Old men in faded jackets sat hunched around a corner table, their laughter low, worn down like the brass buttons they still polished out of habit. They were veterans, the forgotten kind, whose wars had ended decades ago but never quite left their bones. Mr. Lamb, small-framed, sharp-eyed despite his 73 years, leaned back slowly in his chair. The stub of a cigarette clung to his lip as he glanced around at the others. "Same damn story," he muttered, pointing to the television airing another shallow war movie. The others chuckled. He sipped his beer, placed it beside his cap, dark green, with Vietnam veteran stitched in gold thread, slightly frayed, proudly worn. That was when the door opened, and Trouble walked in on steel-toed boots.
6 of them.
Young, loud, the type that grew muscle but not maturity. Leather vests emblazoned with a skull-gripping crossed rifles, Iron Reaper MC. They swaggered in with the brittle confidence of men who'd never been punched hard enough to remember. The room changed. The jukebox fell silent, as if sensing the storm. One of them, tall, thick-necked, with the word hate inked across his knuckles, caught sight of Mr. Lamb's cap. He grinned like a jackal. "Well, would you look at this antique?" he sneered, walking over. "Still cosplaying, old man?" Mr. Lamb raised his eyes slowly. Not angry, just tired. That hat has been to places you wouldn't survive 10 minutes in. Wrong answer. The blow came fast and brutal. A sickening thud. Mr. Lamb didn't even have time to stand. The punch landed square on his cheek, sending him crashing sideways, his cap skidding across the wooden floor. His chair fell with a crack, and so did his dignity, for one breathless second. Nobody moved. Not yet. Blood, red, too red for a Thursday night, dripped from his mouth as he tried to get up. His left hand trembled. He touched the floor like a man trying to find a country that no longer existed. Mr. Dung, sitting 3 seats away, reached for his phone with fingers stiff from Parkinson's. He didn't even lift his eyes. He just pressed one button and whispered like it was a prayer. VFW Post. Come home. Right now. The bikers laughed, loud and feral. One grabbed a pitcher from the bar and poured it over Mr. Lamb's fallen cap. Another kicked his chair aside, as if to erase the memory of resistance. The bartender, a kid, barely 25, froze, paralyzed by the standoff between old ghosts and young monsters. But the silence that followed was not empty. It was charging. It was the silence of men who had once held the line in places where hell had a name. It was the silence of old lions, teeth dull but hearts still war-forged. It was the silence before everything changed. And outside, in the dark, boots were already moving. The sound of the front door swinging shut was like a gunshot in the stillness that followed the assault. Mr. Lamb, now slumped against the bar, blinked slowly as blood dripped down his chin and onto the floorboards that had once echoed with toasts, not threats. He didn't groan, didn't curse. He just breathed, steady, defiant, ancient. The bikers roamed the bar now like predators who had tasted blood and liked the texture. One grabbed a photo off the wall, black and white, war-torn, for men in camouflage smiling in front of a tank, and tossed it to the floor. The glass shattered like bone. Another began humming a tune, off-key and mocking. "Where are your medals now, Gramps?" he said, leaning close to Mr. Lamb, who still hadn't spoken. His silence was beginning to itch, but the bar's silence was deceptive, because the call had gone out, and they were coming. The first to arrive was Sao Rao, still wearing his butcher's apron, hands stained not with blood this time but with fish sauce and chili oil. He didn't speak as he entered. He only took off the apron slowly and folded it, setting it down on the bar as if preparing for prayer. Then he walked to Mr. Lamb and kneeled, not to cry, not to fuss, but to check the angle of the jaw, to feel the pulse beneath the skin, to understand. Behind him came Hung Chot, with his limp and his quiet fury, dragging an old aluminum bat with the words Ton Hoa 1972 etched into its side. He didn't walk like a man coming into a bar. He walked like a memory breaking back into the world. And then Uncle Thin, long retired from the security guard post downtown, but always watching. He closed the door behind him with a click. The kind of click that said this place was now sealed. No one in. No one out. Not until justice remembered how to stand. The bikers noticed. Not all at once, but they began to feel it. That shift in air pressure. That sense that something had tilted, and they were no longer in control. Their laughter came a bit too loud now. One of them leaned on the bar and muttered, "What is this, a bingo club reunion?" Still, none of the old men replied. They moved like clockwork, each action built from a lifetime of knowing where the exits were, where the shadows lived, and what violence looked like when it didn't come from bravado but from bone-deep principle. The 20 minutes that followed did not explode. They simmered. The young men paced, mocked, spilled drinks, tried to provoke. One of them even shoved Cao Rao's folded apron onto the floor. The insult was deliberate. But Cao didn't flinch. He simply stared, his eyes not wide with fear, but narrowed in calculation. His silence was not surrender. It was measurement. Outside, headlights began to line the street. Not sirens. Not cops. Just a growing crowd of tired old Toyotas and dusty scooters. Men stepping out slowly, shoulders hunched from age, eyes sharpened by history. Some wore mechanic overalls. Some carried nothing but thermoses of green tea and the calm of the long-suffering. But they were all here because Lam had fallen, and that meant something. Inside, the bikers were finally uneasy. One muttered, "We should go." Another said, "Just old men." A third, quieter now, replied, "They're not afraid." And he was right, because fear had long ago been burned out of these men in the jungles of Quang Tri, in re-education camps, in cold tenements of forgotten alleys. What remained was not rage, not vengeance, just a nameless fire. It had no slogan, no speech, no chant, just a look in the eye that said, "We've buried brothers. You're just noise." Then Mr. Lam stood. His legs wobbled. Blood still stained his face. But he stood. And when he picked up his soaked cap from the floor, wrung it dry with trembling fingers, and placed it gently back on his head, the room went still. The fire had spoken. It was time. The room had gone silent the moment Mr. Lam stood, but the stillness didn't last long. Because then, like the final beat of a war drum, the door burst open. It didn't creak. It exploded, flung wide by a gust of wind, and something older, stronger, invisible. And through it stepped not a gang, not a mob, but family. A family that bled together long before these streets knew their names. A family not built on blood, but on sacrifice, code, and survival. The military family. First came Chien Bois, all chest and scars, who once carried a wounded comrade 20 kilometers through rice paddies under fire, and now carried nothing but a single canvas bag, silent, heavy, sacred. No one asked what was in it. Everyone knew. History. Consequence. Then Nguyen Van Du, glasses thick as the past, who once cracked codes in bunkers lit by kerosene and enemy flares. His hands trembled from age, but when he adjusted his belt, an old canvas military issue, it wasn't nostalgia. It was preparation. One by one they stepped in. They Phuc, the medic with a limp and a stare that once calmed a boy with his leg blown off. Hai Mu, who hadn't seen sunlight since '82 but could still hear a lie in a man's breath. Ko Duyan, not a soldier by title, but who kept a radio base running under bombing raids for 2 years without sleep, without thanks, without breaking. They filled the room not with numbers, but with weight. The kind of weight that made young men forget their swagger. And in the center stood the bikers, stiff now, pretending to be casual, trying to recapture that moment of dominance that had slipped from their fingers the minute they laid a hand on Mr. Lam. But dominance was gone. And, in its place, reckoning. One of them laughed, thin and forced. "Is this a joke? A reunion of ghosts?" They Phuc stepped forward, cane tapping, voice quiet but slicing.
No.
This is the last place your name will echo. The youngest biker stepped forward, tattooed, full of bad choices and late-night bravado. We didn't come here for war, he muttered, though his eyes darted to the door like a man already writing his escape route. No, Cao Rao answered, finally speaking. But you brought one. And now it was here. The veterans didn't brandish weapons. They didn't raise fists. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was force. Their bodies, aged, bent, some trembling, spoke of things these boys could never fathom. Not because they were too young, but because they had never been tested. You think you're wolves, said Lam, his voice hoarse but steady. You don't know what a pack is. That's when the formation happened, not by command, not by signal, but instinct. A subtle step forward. A half circle. A shield wall. Each veteran moved just slightly. But the room shifted on its axis. The bikers were no longer in control. They were inside a ring. Not of fists, but of truth. One of the older bikers, maybe the smarter one, tried to speak. Tried to plead. We didn't mean. But no one spoke over him. They just watched him talk. Watched him shrink. Until his own voice collapsed under the weight of his cowardice. Then the old men moved, slow, deliberate, coordinated. Not to attack, but to escort. One by one, they walked the bikers to the door. No violence, just inevitability. Each step was like a drumbeat carved into the earth. When the last one reached the threshold, Cao Rao said, "Take one look behind you." The biker turned and saw what real strength looked like. Not fury, not vengeance. Just men who had already buried brothers, carried entire platoons on their backs, and lived long enough to know that dignity is louder than any threat. The bikers stepped into the night.
The door closed.
And for the first time in over an hour, the bar was just a bar again. But no one sat. No one poured a drink. Because tonight wasn't about memory. It was about a line, one quietly drawn, silently protected. And how fools mistook silence for surrender. The door had barely finished closing before the room exhaled, not in relief, but in release. It was as if something sacred had passed through. Something older than laws, deeper than punishment. Justice. But not the kind written in codes and carried in leather holsters.
No.
This was the kind that lived in memory, breath, and scars. The kind that didn't need permission. And never asked for backup. No one reached for a phone. No one thought to call the police. Not out of distrust, though that, too, lingered like old smoke, but because everyone in that room knew. The system couldn't hold what had just happened. Couldn't understand it. Would reduce it to forms, statements, security footage that captured nothing of truth. Because truth had no footage. It had eyes. Like Cao Rao's, eyes that had once stared down tanks from bamboo thickets and still didn't blink when rage knocked on his door. He stood now by the old photograph near the altar, young men in uniform, standing in the rain, faces gaunt but alive. He didn't touch it. He didn't have to. That photo wasn't a memory. It was a witness. Behind him, the others settled into silence. Not the empty kind. The kind full of things too weighty for words.
War. Love. Loss.
And this, tonight, just another name added to the long ledger of things they had endured to keep peace from breaking. Qian Bo lit a cigarette with the kind of slowness that said he'd rather light incense. Hai Mu sipped tea that had gone cold but tasted sweeter somehow. Ko Duyan adjusted a curtain. Not for sunlight. There was none left, but as if covering the eyes of a past that had seen too much already. Mr. Lam sat down again, the stool creaking like it had waited all evening for his weight to return. He poured himself a small cup of rice wine, his hand still bruised from the first blow. But he didn't wince. That bruise was a medal, worn not for fighting but for not retreating. The police wouldn't understand, Qian murmured, voice like gravel under rain. They'd ask why we didn't call earlier, Dian added, not looking up. Why we let them in. They don't understand what it means, Cao Rao said quietly. To protect something without uniforms. Without sirens. Just presence. And there it was. Justice, not as an institution but as a vow. A quiet one, made long ago between men who had nothing left but each other. They didn't wear badges, but they carried the weight of graves, of promises whispered into radios under enemy fire. They didn't hand out sentences, but they remembered names. And some things, like mercy or warning, they gave only once. In the eyes of the world, nothing had happened. No arrests, no court dates, no headlines. But something had happened. Something that would echo. Because the bikers would not return. Not because they feared pain, but because they had tasted something rarer. Something far more dangerous than violence. Accountability. Without spectacle. They had looked into the faces of those who had already paid the price of silence, and who would not allow injustice to become inheritance. And now the street outside was quiet again. Not safer, necessarily, but balanced. Inside, someone finally turned on the music. Not loud. Just enough to remind the bones in the room that life went on. The old cassette spun a melody from another era, simple, coarse, beautiful. A song that once played through jungle nights and rationed rice. No police report would ever hold that song. But justice had been done. Not with noise, but with memory. Not with metal bars, but with the presence of men who still stood, long after the world forgot what they once stood for.
It was past midnight now.
The kind of hour where shadows deepen and the world outside forgets itself. But inside the small tea house, its roof patched with rusted tin and old resistance slogans still faintly painted on the back wall, time had stopped. Or maybe it had circled back. To a different war, a different night, the same men. Cao Rao carefully refilled each cup. Not with haste, not with ceremony, just presence. His hands trembled slightly, not from age, but from the memory that always came with this hour. The others sat in silence, their bodies sunk into old stools that remembered every scar, every reunion, every word left unspoken after battle. The storm had passed, but not in the sky. It had passed through them, violent and sudden, testing something fragile but unbreakable. And they had endured, not with fists alone, but with something sharper. Something that bends but never breaks, brotherhood. No one spoke of the incident. Not directly. They never did. The language of veterans is layered, coded in shared pain and silent nods. What mattered now wasn't the victory. It was the gathering after. The sacred ritual of reassembling, not just the room, but each other. Remember Quila? Haimu's voice cracked like old wood. He'd be laughing at us tonight, saying we got soft, taking that long to handle a couple punks. Chien Bora smiled, then laughed a low, weathered sound. He'd have knocked them out with a soup ladle. Everyone laughed. The kind of laughter that sounds like survival. Laughter that tastes like old rice wine and smells faintly of gun oil and menthol. In that moment, they weren't old. They weren't broken. They were just there. Together. The kettle hissed like it always did, faithful, warm, anchoring. Outside, a dog barked once, and then went quiet. Even the night seemed to know not to disturb this circle. On the altar near the window, incense coiled in the shape of time. Photographs of men now dust and names carved into the granite of forgotten hills watched over them. And somehow, in the way the flame flickered, it felt like they were still part of this night too. The ones who didn't come home. The ones who never had a chance to grow old and stubborn. They were here. In the silence between words. In the way Cao Rao poured the last cup and left it untouched.
For them.
Always. Mr. Lamb leaned back and looked at the ceiling, at the water stains shaped like the Mekong, at the spider web spun between the corners like battlefield maps. He breathed in deeply. The bruises on his knuckles had already started to swell. But it didn't hurt. Not compared to the ache of time. Not compared to outliving brothers. You think it ends? He finally asked, not to anyone or maybe to all of them. No, Dean whispered. But that's the point. And there it was again, the truth that never needed to be said out loud. What they fought for didn't have borders or flags anymore. It lived in small places like this. In cups of tea. In the act of showing up when no one else would. They didn't need medals. They didn't need to be remembered in history books. They just needed each other. And every night like this, every story told with a half smile, every silence honored like prayer, was a quiet defiance against being forgotten. The immortal circle wasn't made of armor or glory. It was made of evenings like this. Late night, shared pain, unspoken love, and the unbreakable, wordless vow, I'm still here. As long as you are. Outside, the stars blinked through the cracked sky. The city slept, unaware that justice had walked its streets tonight, that the last guardians of an older world had stood firm, together once more. Inside, the circle held, immortal, unshaken.